There is a business model that has produced some of the most valuable companies in the last 2 decades of American economic history. It powers the app that delivers your lunch, drives you home from the bar, assembles your IKEA furniture, and walks your dog while you are at work. And it is built on a legal classification that its architects spent hundreds of millions of dollars defending, lobbying for, and writing into state law, because without it, the entire financial model collapses. The classification is independent contractor, and the argument for it is that gig workers are not employees. They are entrepreneurs. They set their own hours. They choose their own clients. They are their own bosses. It is flexibility as a product, freedom as a selling point, and for a small number of gig workers in specific circumstances, that framing is partially accurate. But for the majority of the roughly 59 million Americans who did some form of gig work in the last year, the reality is something different. They are performing the core labor of a company, under that company's pricing, under that company's rules, using their own assets, absorbing their own costs, and receiving none of the legal protections that any other employee doing comparable work would be entitled to by law. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand not just how the classification works and why it matters, but why it was chosen deliberately, what it actually costs workers in real dollars, and why the companies that benefit from it have fought harder to protect it than almost any other industry has fought for anything in recent memory. Let's start with the math, because the flexibility argument sounds compelling right up until you run the actual numbers. Meet Carlos. Carlos drives for a rideshare platform in a mid-sized American city. He drives 40 hours a week, which the platform's own data suggests is typical for drivers who rely on it as their primary income. In a reasonable week, he might gross $900 in fares and tips. That sounds okay, until you subtract what it actually costs to produce that revenue. The IRS standard mileage rate, which approximates the true cost of operating a vehicle, is 67 cents per mile in 2024. Carlos drives approximately 600 miles in that week. That is $402 in vehicle operating costs, depreciation, fuel, maintenance, tires, the accelerated wear that comes from driving commercially on a consumer vehicle. He also owes self-employment tax, which is 15.3% on net earnings. That covers both the employer and employee share of Social Security and Medicare, because Carlos has no employer to split it with him. After mileage deduction, his net earnings are roughly $498. Self-employment tax takes approximately $76 of that. His effective take-home on 40 hours of work, roughly $422. That is $10.55 per hour before income tax, before health insurance, before any retirement contribution, before the cost of the phone data plan the platform requires him to maintain, before the cost of any parking tickets he collects while waiting for rides. And critically, his car is depreciating in real time. A vehicle driven commercially accumulates miles at a rate that can shorten its useful life by years compared to personal use. When Carlos eventually needs to replace his car, that cost does not appear on the platform's balance sheet. It appears on the platform's financial model is, in a meaningful sense, built on Carlos not running this calculation, or running it and deciding it is still better than his alternatives. Neither of those outcomes requires the platform to pay for his health insurance. Now let's zoom out to the industry level, because the individual math becomes a systemic issue at scale. Uber has somewhere between 3 and 4 million active drivers in the United States. If every one of those drivers were classified as an employee, Uber would owe employer payroll taxes on their earnings, minimum wage guarantees in every state where they operate, unemployment insurance contributions, workers' compensation coverage for on-the-job injuries, and potentially health insurance under the Affordable Care Act for anyone working over 30 hours per week. Estimates from economists who have modeled this range widely, but the general consensus is that full employee classification would add between 20% and 40% to Uber's labor costs. A company that has struggled to achieve consistent profitability, even with workers classified as contractors would, under employee classification, face a fundamentally different business equation. The contractor model is not just a preference, it is load-bearing, remove it, and the financial architecture of the company changes substantially. And Uber knows this, which is why, when California passed AB 5 in 2019, a law that would have reclassified most gig workers as employees, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates spent a combined $205 million on Proposition 22, a ballot initiative to carve themselves out of the law. $205 million on a single ballot measure in a single state. It was the most expensive ballot initiative campaign in California history. The companies outspent the opposition by roughly 10 to 1. They flooded the airwaves with ads about protecting driver flexibility. They sent push notifications directly to users through their own apps, which is a level of direct campaign communication that most political candidates can only dream of. They won. Proposition 22 passed. The $205 million investment protected a classification that saves those companies billions annually in labor costs. That is not civic engagement. That is an ROI calculation. And they ran the same playbook in other states, funding campaigns, lobbying legislatures, and threatening to exit markets as leverage to preserve a worker classification that the company's own internal documents sometimes undermine. Leaked internal research from multiple platforms has shown that a significant portion of their drivers' work hours, consistent with full-time employment, that many rely on the platform as their primary income source, and that driver turnover is high and driver satisfaction is systematically lower than the flexibility narrative suggests. But classification as a contractor depends on legal tests, not on economic reality. And the companies have invested enormously in ensuring the legal tests are interpreted in ways that favor the classification they need. Now here is the historical parallel that should feel familiar. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, certain large employers operated what were called company towns. A mining company or a textile mill would own the town where its workers lived. It owned the housing, the stores, the schools, and sometimes the churches. Workers were paid in company scrip, currency, that could only be spent at company stores, which charged prices that ensured the wages effectively circulated back to the employer. Workers had the nominal freedom to leave, but they had company, held debt, nowhere else to go, and no savings denominated in real currency. The freedom was theoretical. The dependency was structural. The gig economy is not a company town. The analogy has limits, but the underlying dynamic, freedom as a brand, dependency as the operational reality, has a lineage that is worth recognizing. A gig worker can log off whenever they want, but if the platform adjusts the algorithm to reduce their ride assignments after they decline too many, their effective earnings drop without any formal action. If the platform changes its pricing structure, the worker absorbs the impact. If the platform deactivates their account for reasons that do not require explanation or appeal, their income disappears overnight with no unemployment insurance available to them, because they were never employees. The control is algorithmic rather than supervisory. The dependency is financial rather than geographical. But the fundamental asymmetry between a large corporation setting the terms and an individual worker accepting them, because the alternatives are worse, is structurally similar to arrangements that labor law spent a century trying to regulate. And that brings us to what the contractor classification actually strips away. Because the loss is not just abstract. Minimum wage laws do not apply to independent contractors. If Carlos's effective hourly rate after expenses falls below his state's minimum wage, the platform has no legal obligation to make up the difference. Overtime laws do not apply. If Carlos works 60 hours in a week, he has no legal right to overtime pay. Workers' compensation does not apply in most states. If Carlos is injured in an accident while on a delivery, his medical bills are his problem. The platform's liability is limited. Unemployment insurance does not apply. If the platform deactivates Carlos's account or he cannot work for a period, he cannot file for unemployment benefits. He paid into the system through his taxes for years. He cannot draw from it. And employer retirement contributions do not apply. The 401k match, the pension contribution, the defined benefit plan, none of these exist for gig workers. Whatever retirement security Carlos has is entirely self-funded on earnings that have already absorbed his vehicle costs and self-employment taxes. The contractor classification does not just affect current income. It affects the entire financial arc of a working life. A worker who spends a decade in gig employment arrives at 50 with no employer retirement contributions, potentially significant vehicle depreciation, no guaranteed minimum wage history, and no unemployment safety net during the periods of low demand the platform's algorithm produces. And because gig workers skew toward people with fewer alternative options, the population bearing these costs is disproportionately the one least equipped to absorb them. Now, the flexibility argument deserves a genuine response, because it is not entirely false. There are people for whom gig work provides a genuinely valuable flexibility. Parents who need to work around school schedules, people managing chronic illness, students supplementing income between classes, people who have a primary job and want to earn additional income on their own schedule. For these workers, the contractor model has real value. But here is the structural dishonesty in how the industry uses this argument. The flexibility that exists for supplemental workers is used to justify a classification that is applied to primary income workers, for whom that flexibility is largely theoretical. Carlos, working 40 hours a week because he has no other option, does not experience the app as flexible. He experiences it as his job. He just experiences it as a job without a minimum wage, without overtime, without workers' comp, and without an employer contributing to his retirement. The flexibility argument describes the experience of one kind of gig worker and uses it to justify a classification that covers a very different kind. And that bait and switch is not accidental. It is the rhetorical core of a legal and political strategy worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the platforms deploying it. So what do you do with this information? If you use gig platforms, you are not morally obligated to stop. But understanding that the price you pay for convenience is subsidized by workers, absorbing costs that are invisible to you, is useful context. If you do gig work, run the actual math before committing to it as a primary income strategy. The gross earnings, number the platforms, advertise is not your take-home. Vehicle costs, self-employment taxes, the absence of benefits, and the absence of employer retirement contributions all have to be factored against what you would net from a W-2 position with equivalent hours and comparable gross pay. The comparison is almost never as favorable to gig work as the headline rate suggests. And if you have any interest in the policy dimension, the debate is not really about flexibility versus security. It is about who bears the costs of running a service business. Currently, gig workers bear a disproportionate share of those costs and have no legal mechanism to negotiate otherwise. That is a policy choice, not an economic inevitability. So I want to hear where you land on this. Do you think the gig worker classification is appropriate and beneficial, preserving flexibility that millions of workers genuinely value and that heavy-handed reclassification would destroy, but deliberate corporate strategy to externalize labor costs onto workers and the public safety net, dressed in the language of freedom, but functioning as a deprivation of rights, or C, somewhere in between, where the flexibility benefit is real, but should be paired with portable benefits and minimum earnings, guarantees that apply regardless of classification. Drop your take in the comments. And the next time you see an ad from a gig platform talking about empowering entrepreneurs and celebrating the freedom of the open road, remember that the freedom they are celebrating is partly their freedom from paying payroll taxes, workers' compensation, minimum wage compliance, and retirement contributions for a workforce that built their valuation to the billions. That is not entrepreneurship they are selling. That is a cost structure, and you are looking at it from the wrong end.